They think that a quick bit of bombing will sort the matter out, but in fact, I think they will find that it will last far longer than they've gambled for.
So, has the White House figured out a clear strategy for Libya? Or could this be a page from the history books? Only see Yugoslavia, 1999. And Sarah Palin's done it. Huckabee, Romney, and Barber, too. So does the road to 2012 always pass through Israel? Disaster images that make the world stand still. That was the case with Japan. But what if the media isn't there? Do disasters still happen? It's Thursday, March 24th, 8 p.m. in Washington, D.C. I'm Kristine Frazao. You're watching RT. Well, today marks the 12th anniversary of the NATO bombings in Yugoslavia. It was a different time, but with the recent military outburst of the West against Libya, it's hard not to draw some parallels between the two attacks. RT's Anastasia Churkina analyzes the wars, past and present.
In March, seasons change. Sunshine invites Americans onto the streets. American politicians invite themselves to foreign countries. March 1999. The U.S. and its NATO allies bomb Yugoslavia.
Armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo.
March 2011. America's next Democratic president and a new coalition of the willing attack Libya.
The UN Security Council passed a strong resolution that demands an end to the violence against citizens. It authorizes the use of force.
The attacks on Libya were sanctioned by the UN Security Council, in contrast to the bombings of Yugoslavia. There was no such green light in 1999, and the bombings were led by NATO, the first time the military alliance attacked a sovereign nation, a non-NATO member posing no threat to the group. Similarly, Libya poses no external threat, and there are other striking parallels between the conduct of these wars. The enemy then, Slobodan Milosevic, dubbed the new Hitler. The enemy of today, the eccentric Muammar Gaddafi, in power for over 40 years.
As much as Gaddafi is this John Galliano-dressed freak show, he modernized Libya for a while.
Now similarly villainized by the U.S.
Colonel Gaddafi needs to step down from power and leave.
The goal now and back then, getting rid of a leader no longer favored by the West, taking sides with a questionable opposition in what started as a civil war.
What we're seeing is a full-fledged war, including attempting, evidently, to kill the head of state of the targeted country and other leaders of the government. That, again, is a page from the Yugoslav book of 12 years ago. What has the world learned? Evidently not much.
The official reason for Western involvement, a so-called humanitarian mission, a term coined amid the bombings of 1999.
You say, well, you can bomb a country because you're coming to save its people. And essentially that was the rationale behind the war in Yugoslavia.
A rationale still relied upon, but widely questioned.
You do not come to the rescue of civilians with bombs and missiles, okay? Bombs and missiles are part of a killing machine, and they inevitably will kill civilians.
The engine of that machine, both then and now, a no-fly zone, code for aerial bombings. Fueled in Libya by the additional all-necessary measures, code for war, where the line between the enemy in a foreign land and its civilians often gets blurred. It did in Yugoslavia, with thousands of people killed and close to 1 million displaced.
After the war, when they did a count, they found that U.S. NATO bombs had destroyed 14 tanks in Serbia. 14 tanks. But they had also bombed 437 schools.
A similar scenario is now predicted in Libya. Obama vows the anti-Gaddafi war will last days and not weeks. That was the failed plan in Yugoslavia. Bombings lasted 2.5 months.
They think that a quick bit of bombing will sort the matter out, but in fact, I think they will find that it will last far longer than they've gambled for.
12 years on, Serbia still remembers the losses inflicted by U.S. NATO bombings. The U.S. is now involved in its 4th attack of a foreign nation in these same 12 years. Anastasia Churkina, RT, New York.
All right, so from two evil dictators to humanitarian crises, we're just connecting some historical dots here, but we should talk about this a little deeper. There is one man who calls what's happening in Libya, quote, a bad science fiction movie written by mad political scientists. That man is the publisher of the Trends Journal and director of the Trends Research Institute, Gerald Celente. And earlier he told me that the U.S. will make up any excuse to attack countries of their choosing.
What makes Gaddafi so different than the dictator in Yemen? I'll give you an example of the hypocrisy. On the same day that Obama announced that we were going to go into Libya, some 50 people were killed in Yemen. I didn't hear about the overthrow in that, for that government. The same day, the United States sent in a Predator drone missile into Pakistan, if you want to talk about brutality, and killed some 38 innocent people. They missed, I guess, those suspected militant targets that they hit so infrequently. So all this is the United States doing what it's become accustomed to do, and that is attack any country it wants to at any time for any reason that it could make up. And the new reason that they made up is perfectly Orwellian, humanitarian crisis. So you kill people to solve a humanitarian crisis, and you take dictators out that you don't like, because really, what's behind this? And I've said it before. Would the United States be in Iraq if their major export was broccoli? Or would they be in Libya if they weren't holding on to the sweetest of sweet crude oil on the planet?
And Gerald, we should mention, you know, we've been following some new developments. They're happening as we speak. Reports that NATO forces will, in fact, take command of the mission in Libya. But I got to point out here, whether or not that does happen in the coming minutes or hours, the negotiations have been a little hairy. Still some major differences in principle between NATO members. And I also want to show sort of what we've been seeing leading up to this point, some blatant finger pointing, much of it from Turkey to France. Now, here's a quote from Turkey's prime minister saying the following: "I wish that those who only see oil, gold mines, and underground treasures when they look in Libya's direction would see the region through glasses of conscience from now on." Sort of playing, Gerald, to what you were just talking about. What do you make of this, and also of, you know, what's happening next there?
NATO's a code word for the United States. They've changed the language. Every time you read in the New York Times or any of these other so-called papers of record, when people get killed or there are strikes in Afghanistan that kill innocent people, they always use the term NATO. It's mostly the U.S. And yes, the Prime Minister of Turkey is 100% correct. Again, the hypocrisy.
An official report, but I'm wondering, do you have any take on why, you know, where I live here in D.C., there doesn't seem to be as much of a issue with new home sales?
Yeah, well, you live in D.C. I mean, that's the government. That's where they create jobs. You look at the decline in federal jobs since, what, about 8 million have been lost since the Great Recession began. There's hardly been any decline at all. So that's the business of government, is to build more federal government. That's why housing prices are stable there. Hey, take a trip to Cincinnati. You'll have a lovely time in Las Vegas. So that's where your collapses are happening.
All right, Gerald Celente, publisher of the Trends Journal and director of the Trends Research Institute. Now on to an invasion of a different kind, the invasion into Israel by could-be presidential candidates from these here United States. Sarah Palin is the latest one, but she follows Rudy Giuliani, Mike Huckabee, Mitt Romney, Haley Barbour, and George Pataki in visits to the Holy Land all over the last few months. RT's Lauren Lyster is in our New York studio. And Lauren, it's almost as if establishing your credentials in Tel Aviv is as vital as, say, stumping right here in New Hampshire.
It certainly seems so, but though in the case of Sarah Palin, her people said the trip was personal and not political, but yet it was the American Jewish Coalition who was in talks with her for her to make this trip, and they report that they've made requests to all of the Republican politicians who have been rumored or said to have possibly be contenders in the 2012 presidential elections to make trips to Israel. They meet with Israeli leaders, they take pictures with Benjamin Netanyahu. So the real question is, why is it so important for these politicians to be hobnobbing with the prime minister of another country when they've not even so much as announced their candidacy for president here at home?
The pilgrimage of presidential hopefuls. The Western Wall, a photo op with Netanyahu, all first stops ahead of a possible run for the U.S. top spot.
In some ways, I think of Israel as the new Iowa. You know, it's like...
Spring, in the way some members...
The Jewish population in the United States is less than 3%. That's quite a sizable number coming from a minority of the population. Now, as far as who pays for these trips, in many cases, it is the Jewish political organizations. The Republican Jewish Coalition I mentioned was in talks to send Palin. She actually went through a Christian group, which was a source of some controversy by a board member from the RJC. David Frum wrote a blog about that. Now, Haley Barbour was sent by the RJC. Back in 2007, Mitt Romney was. According to an Israeli publication, Mitt Romney, his most recent trip was paid for by AIPAC. So you can see that the pro-Israel lobby does pay to get these candidates over there.
Lauren, let's talk about what these candidates or potential could-be candidates do once they get to Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu seems more than willing to meet with anyone who comes over. Lots of photo opportunities and perhaps closed-door discussions surrounding that. But one thing you don't see, as many of them visiting the West Bank or Gaza. You want to talk about this a little more?
Yeah, that is something that you don't see, and that's something that many activists argue is a huge issue. I mean, even General Petraeus, you heard say last year that America's pro-Israel stance and the perception of being more heavily supporting of Israel in the Mideast peace process by the Arab world was a challenge for him in doing his job as a commander of that area. So clearly this is an issue. The Palestinian issue is something that United States lawmakers, according to activists, absolutely need to understand, and yet you don't see them going into the Palestinian territories at all. And where somewhere like Gaza, you have people reporting it to be a humanitarian crisis and essentially occupied territory, but yet you have U.S. politicians not even having an understanding of what that means. And really kind of case in point, driving that home, Sarah Palin reportedly tried to go to Bethlehem, but she and her group that organized the trip evidently didn't know that that wasn't in Israel, just showing that how little understanding she really has of the dynamics, the true dynamics in the region.
Well, wait a minute, Lauren. She can see Russia from her backyard, I thought.
She can, but she certainly can't see Palestine, and it doesn't seem like she got any better of a vision of it on this last trip there to Israel. All
right, real briefly, Lauren, I remember there was a woman in your report. She implied or said that AIPAC can punish people who vote the wrong way. Talk about what you think she might have meant by this.
She meant it very literally, and one of the ways which she said that AIPAC has done this in the past or been reported to is by heavily funding opponents of candidates that they want to see out. In one case where this was reported to have happened was with Cynthia McKinney, who you saw in my report. She was a U.S. Congresswoman, and American Jewish money poured into her opponent, and essentially that's why some believe that she was not reelected. Now, this also is believed by some to have played a role in why George H.W. Bush wasn't elected. He went head-to-head in '92 with Israeli leadership over the issue of settlements, and some believe that that lost him his second term.
All right, Lauren Lyster from our New York studio. And earlier I spoke to the editor of Counterpunch, Alexander Coburn. I asked him why the road to the White House doesn't seem complete without a trip to Israel. Here's his take.
American politics are controlled by, factional groups, obviously. I mean, not to talk about the Israeli lobby. The Miami Cubans, for example, have had a huge influence on American foreign policy ever since the late 50s because it's an important electoral state. The Jewish vote in New York and California is extremely important politically. Therefore, every political candidate who aspires to be president of the United States responds
to these visits that are becoming, I would even say mandatory.
Oh, they've been mandatory for years. Other important lobbies, well, you could start with the defense industrial complex. Why is the defense budget higher than it's ever been, even though the US military is smaller and there's no longer the Soviet Union to justify all the expense. That's hooked into the Israeli lobby, by the way. But no, it's one of the most powerful lobbies in the United States, no question about it.
I want to also switch gears. Throughout the show, we've been talking a lot about the situation in Libya. I'm just wondering your take. Certainly, it's very interesting to see, just thinking back when I saw the way that the English reacted, not the leaders, but the public reacted when, you know, Great Britain sort of went side by side and with the U.S. in Iraq. Now Great Britain seems to be instigating, in some ways, what's going on in Libya. I feel like David Cameron's been pretty gung-ho, even though the public there remains pretty overwhelmingly against it. Do you have any insight into this?
Well, I would have said the French would have been perhaps as important, even maybe more important than the British, because it was, after all, Sarkozy, whose popularity in France is around 20% right now, who was the one who suddenly, amazingly, recognized the Benghazi rebels as the legitimate government of Libya. This is an extraordinary event.
I forget somebody said that Sarkozy was not only launching bombs, but perhaps launching his re-election campaign. I thought that was really interesting.
Well, he's trying to save his political neck. But in this country, and people talk about oil, I don't think oil is a factor in this at all. In this country, the inspirers of this, I think, utterly insane military venture, probably as stupid as anything since Napoleon tried to. And although I don't believe Obama was keen on intervention at all, nor is the U.S. military or Secretary of the Defense Gates, they felt they had to go along. Of course, the joke is that Eastern Libya is basically the people who are the rebels. They provided in the Iraq War more young men to commit suicide against the U.S. in Iraq than any other country.
And that was Alexander Coburn, editor of Counterpunch. Still ahead here on RT, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So when it comes to reporting on disasters, where are the words without the pictures of destruction? That story coming up next.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Tom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
You know that saying, you got to see it to believe it? Like Japan's earthquake and tsunami that have been at the forefront.
Other countries, because they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the cameras that were right there, like they were in Japan. From dozens of different angles, you saw the waves coming in, which is the kind of footage in our business. Unfortunately, that is the dream, to be able to get that kind of footage. And you don't get that in some of the other third world countries. You just see the aftermath.
The shots of the aftermath of a cyclone that hit Myanmar 3 years ago are horrifying. More than 138,000 people were killed. The government of Myanmar limited access to foreign journalists, and there were no live pictures from the disaster zone. And, as it happens in the news business, very quickly, the story died down.
If there is a disaster in the middle of Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, obviously you won't have the same kind of images that you have from Japan, where TV is a 24/7 operation. That's why this tsunami in Japan is so huge in terms of worldwide coverage, because there are cameras absolutely everywhere in Japan. If this was in China, I would say Western China, for instance, you have probably 1/10 of the coverage, because the images are not there.
The earthquake in the Sichuan province in China killed around 68,000 people. And again, the coverage was limited, and so therefore was world interest in the disaster there.
Human tragedy, whether in Japan or China or Chile, deserves world sympathy.
But more often than not, the attention span of world news channels depends on which tragedy makes better television. I'm Gayane Chichakyan reporting from Washington, RT.
Certainly very interesting to think about. If there's no cameras, will there be coverage? Unfortunately, we're out of time. But for more on the stories we covered, go to our website, rt.com/USA. We've also got a lot of great stuff on our YouTube page, youtube.com/RTAmerica. I'm Kristine Frazao. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.
Welcome to the future, bringing you the latest in science and technology.